It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and Joe Dolan.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast, presented, of course, as always, by DraftKings. Speaking of DraftKings, next week, Joe and I will announce a bunch of winners of our best ball contest. As a reminder, you can just use the code ROSS over at goodranchers.com, which, by the way, is a great Father's Day gift. You can rate and review any of the RT media shows. We might even announce all 10 contestants next week. I haven't decided yet. So get your best ball entries in now. It's free. You're not going to have to pay for an entry into a DraftKings best ball contest. And the winner, first of all, you get to go against me and Joe. Second of all, the winner takes home all the money. I don't know how much it is, but $0 to enter. You take home all the winnings. That math is good. That math works. GoodRanchers.com, code Ross, rate and review any of the RT media shows. Heck, you can even get your father or a father figure, a story from myfrontpagestory.com. Whatever you do, though, make sure you email it to me, ross@rosstucker.com, so I see it, so I can make sure you are one of the contestants for the June best ball draft, which will be here before you know it. Here's what we're going to do today. We're going to dive into all of these wide receivers with contract issues. We got a bunch of them not showing up for mandatory minicamp. I know a lot of you are already playing in best ball drafts, so we got to kind of have an idea of how to treat these guys, how to treat the other players on their team, how to maybe even treat teams they might go to. There's a lot there. We still have some mandatory mini camps going on this week, so we'll get Tom Brawley from fantasypoints.com next week to go over everything we learned that is of significance from OTAs and mini camps from a fantasy football perspective. I mentioned Fantasy Points. That's where we got our guy Joe Dolan, at FG_Dolan, the fantasy gangster. If and when you go over to fantasypoints.com, and there's no time like the present, use that code 24FEAST. I'm merely Ross Tucker, former NFL offensive lineman, 5 teams, 7 years, bunch of different podcasts. Thought Solomon Wilcots was excellent on today's Ross Tucker football podcast. We'll have Greg Cosell tomorrow previewing the NFC West. Love hearing Greg talk about Sean McVay and the Rams and Kyle Shanahan and the Niners and more. So that should be a good one as well. Joe, there's a lot to get to. I guess I want to start with just, I think it's the expected retirement, I suppose, of Darren Waller. Does this move the needle in any way for you? I mean, he had a couple of really good years, Joe.
Yeah, he had some great years, Ross, obviously, and he deserves all the credit in the world. Overcame a lot of problems, overcame a lot of issues, addiction, and put together just an incredible NFL career. His breakout season, Ross, came when he was 27 years old after he converted to tight end. And I think Darren Waller made that look so effortless that everybody's just like, any failed big wide receiver should just convert to tight end now. And while that might be the case, it's what N'Keal Harry's trying to do. I believe Devin Funch has tried to do it. Jordan Matthews tried to do it. Darren Waller had such a unique athleticism to him that he was able to really become one of the best tight ends in the NFL. Unfortunately, injuries have robbed him in recent years, and as he gets older, it was just harder for him to recover. His heart really wasn't in it with the Giants last year. At least that's the way I viewed it, and I'm not surprised that he retired. From a fantasy perspective, this does not move the needle at all for me because I was working under the assumption that Darren Waller was not going to be a New York Giant this year. The Giants don't really have a tight end that you'd view as somebody who's going to be fantasy relevant this season. If you think this is something that might make you more interested in Theo Johnson, the rookie out of Penn State who's incredibly athletic for Dynasty, I wouldn't blame you. Theo Johnson's the first Giants tight end getting drafted on best ball sites right now, but he's basically getting drafted outside of the top 30 tight ends. So that is not somebody who is expected to have a whole lot of fantasy relevance as a rookie, but he is athletic. He's got some serious ability and a lot of untapped potential because he didn't produce at Penn State. And you can blame that on the quarterback play. You can blame that on the offense. You can blame it on Johnson. Blame it on whoever you want to. But Darren Waller's retirement does not move the needle for me in the least because I have been operating under the assumption that he would not be a Giant this year.
Yeah, I can add a little bit of flavor here, Joe. As you know, over the years, I've done some Penn State media stuff. Theo Johnson was a very good high school wide receiver. Now, he did it in Canada, and some of the guys covering him looked like they should have been playing hockey instead of playing football, but he was like a 6'5.5", 225-pound wide receiver in high school, just mossing kids left and right and dunking on them. And it's interesting because since he's been at Penn State, they've had a lot of good tight ends. I mean, Tyler Warren is a guy that was also projected to be a day 2 pick. He elected to stay in school at Penn State. He's very talented. And for whatever reason, even though they had horrible wide receivers last year, they would try to throw the ball to the wide receivers and not their 2 day 2 NFL draft pick. Tyler Warren might end up being a first-round pick this year. And I do think Penn State will use him a lot better than he was used under the previous regime. Not quite sure exactly what the logic was there, but you have guys like Theo Johnson, Tyler Warren, you need to use them. I would not be surprised if, Theo Johnson surprises for the Giants. I also saw a post, I think it was Art Stapleton, Joe, saying that Malik Neighbors had the best practice by a Giants wide receiver since Odell this week.
Well, I mean, let's take a look at the Giants wide receiver since Odell. I mean, not really that hard to do. Sterling Shepard obviously has had some good years, but is somebody who fought through injuries. Malik Neighbors right now he's going in the top 3 rounds of fantasy drafts. People have huge expectations for Malik Neighbors, and rightfully so. I mean, this is a guy who some people had ahead of Marvin Harrison Jr. on their draft ranks. I'm not so sure that Malik Neighbors is going to have the quality of quarterback play that Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to have, but there were massive expectations for Malik Neighbors for fantasy football.
Yes, I would think so. Let's dive into now, Joe, some of the other receiver issues around the league because I find them very interesting because there's a lot of people that are playing best ball right now at DraftKings or elsewhere, and they're not quite sure what to do with some of these guys. It seems like most of the time, Joe, these guys end up playing that season for that team, whether they get a Band-Aid contract, a long-term deal done, or what have you. Sometimes they miss a couple games. Sometimes they end up getting traded. Maybe we start with Brandon Aiyuk with the San Francisco 49ers. That one seems about as much of an issue as any. I guess before we even get to Aiyuk, give me your 30,000-foot level on all these receivers with contract issues.
I mean, at some point, it feels like the bubble's kind of got to burst, right? Because, look, Justin Jefferson's going to get paid. He already got paid, but he was always going to get paid. Jamar Chase is going to get paid because these guys are the elite of the elite. And frankly, Brandon Ayuk's going to get paid too. But eventually, one receiver, and we're going to talk about a particular guy who unfortunately might have missed the boat because his former team misread the market and now he's approaching 30. But Brandon Ayuk's going to get paid because he's a great receiver. But at some point, one of these receivers is going to be not so great, and he's going to want this massive deal, and then all of a sudden, the deal's not going to work out, or the team's just going to say, all right, goodbye, man. Is T. Higgins that guy? Is T. Higgins the guy who is going to be there, and the Bengals are going to say, look, dude, you're a really good receiver, but you've had some injury problems, and we got to pay Jamar Chase. So that's the way we're going to go. And I don't know if T. Higgins is going to get the money he's looking for. So I feel like the bubble's got to burst at some point. But the elite of the elite, the Chases, the Bengals are going to re-sign Jamar Chase, okay? It's just a matter of when. The Cowboys are going to re-sign CeeDee Lamb. It's just a matter of when. I think the Cowboys are far more likely to re-sign CeeDee Lamb than they are Dak Prescott. That's not mutually exclusive, but I think they're far more likely to do that. But it's some of these guys who might be, they think they're ones, but they might be more twos. That might be the area where the bubble starts to burst for these wide receivers.
So that's in general. I guess my question for you then is, before we go into each guy individually, Joe, do you have a philosophy when you're drafting in these best balls with guys in these situations, or is it truly a situation-by-situation, case-by-case basis?
It's mostly case-by-case, but for the guys with contract issues, first and foremost, CeeDee Lamb is my number one wide receiver in best ball. Because I think Dallas is going to sign CeeDee Lamb. But then you get to somebody, the next guy with a contract issue is Jamar Chase. The Bengals are going to sign him. The thing about somebody like Brandon Aiyuk, who's carrying kind of a wide receiver 1 ADP right now, is, all right, I'm not as confident that the 49ers are going to sign him. But I also don't think Brandon Aiyuk is going to hold out of actual games. I don't think Brandon Aiyuk is going to end up saying to himself, man, I'm just gonna eat this money to make a point. I think it's more likely he gets traded than he holds out. And if Brandon Aiyuk gets traded, there's a lot of upside there. Remember, there are a lot of mouths to feed in San Francisco. They just signed Christian McCaffrey to a big contract. There's Debo, there's Kittle. They just drafted Ricky Pearsall. So San Francisco actually, in terms of, look, the offense is maybe the best in the NFL. So Brandon Aiyuk, if he gets traded, he might lose some efficiency. But he might gain that back in terms of volume that he might not get with the 49ers. So I'm really confident drafting, well, confident's the wrong word, because I really don't like the second-round wide receivers this year, quite frankly. I kind of view the second-round wide receivers, we talked about this with Graham Barfield a couple of weeks ago. The second-round wide receivers and the third-round wide receivers right now are very similar to me. So I actually like the running backs going in the second round a little bit more. But Brandon Aiyuk, to me, if he gets traded, and he gets traded to an offense that has a competent quarterback, I mean, I feel like a top 5 or 6 wide receiver season is in the range of outcomes. That's why I'm pretty confident drafting Brandon Aiyuk as a wide receiver 1, because I think there's an interesting range of outcomes even if he does get traded.
That's why I'm pretty confident recommending myfrontpagestory.com for Father's Day. There's only a few days left. Most of you still haven't gotten any of the fathers in your life. You probably don't have that many fathers in your life, but any of the father figures in your life, a gift yet, myfrontpagestory.com. Your dad loves the newspaper, dude. He does. Put him on the cover. Give him the cover story he deserves and has always deserved. myfrontpagestory.com. Okay, so we talked about CeeDee Lamb. We talked about Brandon Aiyuk. Another one kind of popped up this week, I guess, Joe, that I was not aware was an issue to this level, such that he was going to be the type of guy that would hold out in this situation, and that's Amari Cooper with the Browns. You know, he's already made a lot of money, and I mentioned that, Joe, because he's probably not afraid to skip, not afraid to cut, not afraid to hold out of training camp, maybe even miss games, because he's already made, what, $80 million the last 4 years?
Yeah, so here's the thing with Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper kind of probably feels like he missed the boat, right? The Cowboys completely misread the wide receiver market. Just utterly. Remember, they gave away Amari Cooper. You know, like, they gave him to the Cleveland Browns. And then the wide receiver market started to explode, and there was guys going for first-round picks, like A.J. Brown. Hollywood Brown got traded for a first-round pick. And so the Cowboys misread that. And now Amari Cooper's sitting here saying, now, wait a minute, my former team misread the market, and now I'm sitting here. Amari Cooper's average guarantee per year on his contract, and Ross, this is obviously a little bit of apples to oranges, because as you've mentioned, he's played out this contract. But his average guarantee on his contract right now is $8 million. on the current contract he's on. He's going to make 23, 24 this year, but the average guarantee is $8 million. That's Gabe Davis money. That's Darnell Mooney money. That's where he's making less right now than Marvin Harrison Jr. in terms of average guarantee. So Amari Cooper right now, I know there's a fantasy Twitter joke about Amari Cooper in terms of, oh, he's still just 22 years old because he came into the league so young. But Amari Cooper turns 30 next week. So Amari Cooper's thinking, I've been really productive here in my 2 years with the Browns. He's missed just 2 games. He's caught 150 passes with the Browns, and he's scored 14 touchdowns. This has been an outrageously productive player. A player who probably looks at the Cowboys and says, you could use me, couldn't you? And I think he's just trying to get one more payday, and he's probably earned it. And quite frankly, I don't know if the Browns can afford not to give him the contract, or at least give him a little bit of extra dough. Because while they have invested in the wide receiver position in Cleveland, they drafted Cedric Tillman last year. I talked to Nathan Zagura, who's their color analyst on the radio, and he thinks Tillman is the kind of guy who can take a second-year leap. They drafted David Bell 2 years ago, Jamari Thrash this year. They traded for Elijah Moore last year, and then, of course, traded for Jerry Jeudy this year. But when I look at that group of receivers, and you're like, well, there's great depth there. And this is probably what Amari Cooper's agent is asking as well. What have those receivers that the Browns have now, though you might say there's great depth there, what have they actually done? I've told you on this podcast, while I think Jerry Jeudy is a far better player than Nelson Aguilar, I implore you to go compare their stats. They're a lot more similar than you'd think. And Jerry Jeudy got a big contract from the Browns this offseason. The Browns did a good job, by the way. They got ahead on the Jerry Jeudy market. But Jerry Jeudy right now, in terms of average guaranteed money, is making the 7th most in the NFL at the wide receiver position. Has Jerry Jeudy earned that? And Amari Cooper is probably sitting there saying, you just traded for this guy. Yeah, he's younger, but I'm better. I've produced way more than this guy in his career. You need me. So Amari Cooper is one where I might be a little bit concerned, but I think the Browns should be smart enough to get a deal done with Amari Cooper. I wouldn't be surprised if this kind of knocks his ADP. Right now, he's going in a similar range of, interestingly enough, T. Higgins, but George Pickens, Christian Kirk, Terry McLaurin, Keenan Allen, Hollywood Brown, another guy who's on a contract year, as is Keenan Allen. I wouldn't be surprised if it knocks him a little bit back there, but I think the Browns should indeed get something done with Amari Cooper. They're an all-in team right now. The Browns are not a wait-and-see team. You made that trade for Deshaun Watson, whether that's a sunk cost or not, but you made that to be a Super Bowl contender. And Amari Cooper is certainly somebody who, if the Browns want to be a Super Bowl contender, he needs to be part of this team.
One thing that's interesting to me about that as you talk, Joe, a couple things. Number one, this is why it's always dangerous when you bring a player in like Jeudy and pay him when there's guys that have already done it for your organization that feel like they deserve an upgrade. The other thing I think is interesting that maybe went under the radar with GM Andrew Berry and head coach Kevin Stefanski getting those contract extensions last week, I think it was. Talked about this on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. I really thought there was a very good chance, Joe, that the owner basically saying, I want Deshaun Watson, get Deshaun Watson, might be what ended up getting Stefanski and Andrew Berry fired. This contract extension is the first clue that I think these guys are staying and Deshaun Watson might be going at some point.
That's a really good point.
Meaning, like, these contract extensions basically now give Berry and Stefanski the ability to do what's best for the team moving forward and acknowledge that Deshaun Watson is a sunk cost. They needed that. Those guys needed this contract extension to be able to feel like they could be in this situation. So I thought that was very interesting. Good point. Well said about Jerry Jeudy. What about another somewhat similar situation? Tyreek Hill doesn't seem all that happy either, Joe. Jalen Waddle just got paid. We all know they're talking with Tua about a contract. I would expect Tua gets paid before Tyreek Hill gets whatever it would be, a third or fourth bite at the apple. But he's the type of guy, too, that might say, I'm not playing unless I get what I want.
Yeah, so Tyreek Hill, mercurial is the kind way to say it, but this is a guy who's always produced when he's been out on the field, and he's an elite competitor. And I can tell you right now, the fantasy markets are not worried about Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill is going basically with the third overall pick in fantasy. I can't imagine that Tyreek Hill is going to sit out time. There hasn't been any really inklings of that. And I maybe we'll reevaluate Tyreek Hill when that time comes, if it turns out that he is going to hold out. But as of right now, not concerned about Tyreek Hill. I think the Dolphins might be be careful what you wish for if they sign Tua and push Tyreek Hill out. But obviously, the Dolphins have to make tough decisions because, look, Jalen Waddle's a lot younger than Tyreek Hill. You know, Tyreek Hill played through injury last year, but he was injured last year. So Jalen Waddle was the right move to extend him. We'll see what they do with Tua. Tua's kind of the interesting, he's kind of the interesting comparison to, is he more Jared Goff or is he more Justin Herbert? I think Dolphin fans would say he's more Justin Herbert. I think a lot of NFL fans would say he's more Jared Goff. And the Dolphins are trying to thread that needle right now with Tua. And let's just say that I don't envy Chris Greer having to navigate the waters that they have in Miami with Tua needing an extension and Tyreek Hill needing an extension. But for fantasy, I'm not worried right now about Tyreek Hill.
You touched on it a little bit earlier, Joe, but just you're not worried about Chase. He's going to get a deal. Could T. Higgins miss games because he's not under contract? You know, he's one of these guys not at minicamp, but he's not getting fined. So he could miss. He could sit out if he chooses.
Yeah, he could, but I don't think he's going to. I talked to Jake Lisco, who does the Locked on Bengals podcast, and I asked him to rank the scenarios. I said, what are the scenarios? I said, these three scenarios are T. Higgins plays for the Bengals, T. Higgins plays for somebody else, meaning he gets traded, T. Higgins sits out. He said T. Higgins plays for the Bengals is so far and above the other two that it's hard to even put the other two on the spectrum because T. Higgins really doesn't have leverage. He's on the franchise tag. You don't want to sit out and have that roll back over. And by the way, the franchise tag is a pretty penny. The franchise tag is $22 million for wide receivers, fully guaranteed when he signs that. So T. Higgins is different than these other guys because he's not getting fined because he's not under contract. He can sign that deal whenever the heck he wants, and maybe he strolls in midway through the preseason. Maybe he strolls in right before week 1. But the Bengals need T. Higgins. He's going to play for the Bengals this year. And I wonder if you can get a little bit of a discount because T. Higgins has, quite frankly, Ross, maybe the most publicized contract situation because he's on the franchise. He's requested the trade. And now he's down, as I mentioned, near Amari Cooper, near like wide receiver 30 in terms of ADP. But I'm not sure T. Higgins has any leverage. His best move really is to play out this year on the franchise tag, enter free agency, and go make bags somewhere else. I'm not worried about Jamar Chase. I'm actually really not worried about T. Higgins right now. I feel like there's a better chance that somebody like Amari Cooper sits out than T. Higgins does.
Any of these other guys, I mean, Chris Godwin, Keenan Allen, Hollywood Brown, guys in the last year of their contract worth discussing?
Those guys are now. Hollywood Brown's really excited to be with his current team. He's been Mr. Chief on their social media. I think he's just excited to play with a really good quarterback. I'm not worried about him. I just feel like guys like Keenan Allen and Chris Godwin, unfortunately, are just going to have to take their medicine. They're now older, and I'm sure they're jealous that they see this wide receiver money creeping up, and they're seeing guys like AJ Brown, and certainly guys like. I can't imagine it feels good to a guy like Chris Godwin and a guy like Keenan Allen to see Jerry Jeudy get the contract that he got. But unfortunately, that's just where it's going right now with the wide receivers. Good wide receivers get paid better than great players at other positions. Average wide receivers are getting the same amount of money as elite running backs. And that's my question and that's a much larger discussion and probably something for Andrew Brandt. Is there going to be a bubble that bursts where people are like, wait a minute, Are we seriously paying Darnell Mooney, Christian McCaffrey money? Is that really where we're going? I think that's something that's a larger discussion. But as of right now, not terribly concerned for fantasy football. Get back with me later this summer if we have to worry about it.
There's a lot going on, Joe, at these mini camps and OTAs. Even just following the Eagles closely, I've noticed it. Looking forward to having Tom Browley on the show next week. Should be fantastic. Check him out on social media at FG_Dolan. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL. We are at Ross Tucker Pod. I'm stuffed. We're done.
Thanks for tuning in to Fantasy Feast. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.